It is morning outside Jerusalem on the second day of the last week of Jesus' life, and something is about to happen that no one walking with him will understand. They are on the road from Bethany, heading into the city. The sun is on their backs. They are hungry because they left before the household had prepared any food. And along the way, they pass a fig tree standing by the road, its branches thick with full green leaves. Jesus walks up to it, pushes the leaves aside, looks for fruit, and finds nothing. Then he speaks to the tree. "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The disciples have seen him command storms and cast out demons and raise the dead. This is different, not a healing, not a rescue, it is a curse. They keep walking. The tree stands there with its leaves. By the next morning, it is dead, withered from the roots up. For 2,000 years, this story has confused the people who love Jesus and armed the people who hate him. It is the only destructive miracle in the Gospels. Every other time Jesus performs a sign, he heals or feeds or delivers someone, and then, on this one Tuesday, he kills a tree. The philosopher Bertrand Russell built an entire essay against Christianity around exactly this passage. His 1927 lecture, "Why I Am Not a Christian," argued, in words close to a direct quote, that Jesus displayed a moral defect in cursing a fig tree that could not possibly have had fruit because it was the wrong time of year for figs. And Russell was drawing on something Mark's Gospel says in the text itself, in verse 13 of chapter 11. It was not the season for figs. The tree had no fruit because no tree had fruit. Passover week, early April. The fig harvest in Judea comes in June. Jesus, a Galilean who had told a dozen parables about fig trees and vineyards, would have known that. And yet, he walked up to a tree doing exactly what a fig tree is supposed to do in March, and he cursed it. Even Charles Spurgeon called this one of the hardest miracles to explain. Modern pastors skip it. Sunday school teachers avoid it. Skeptics circle it like sharks in shallow water. Because on the surface, this is the story of a hungry man losing his temper with a plant. Except it isn't. What almost no one notices is what Jesus does immediately after cursing that tree. He walks straight into Jerusalem, enters the temple courts, and starts turning over tables. The two events are one act, split in half, and wrapped around a second act on purpose by an author who knew exactly what he was doing. Once you see the connection Mark built into his gospel, this stops being the strangest story in the New Testament and becomes one of the most devastating prophecies Jesus ever delivered. To see it, you have to understand the week you have walked into. The week we now call Holy Week begins on a Sunday. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a young donkey, while crowds throw palm branches down in front of him and shout, "Hosanna!" If you have ever seen an image of Palm Sunday, that is the scene. But the political context of that scene is not the peaceful thing it looks like in most stained glass windows. Jerusalem in the spring of 30 AD is not a city. It is a pressure cooker. The population, normally somewhere around 40,000, swells to 2, maybe 300,000 during Passover week, because every observant Jewish male within traveling distance is required by the Torah to come. They come from Egypt, from Persia, from the Greek cities on the coast, from Galilee, from the diaspora, pouring in on foot, on donkey, in caravans, sleeping on rooftops, in fields outside the walls, in every alley. The city smells of animals and cooking fires and unwashed bodies packed too close together. Rome knows exactly how dangerous this week is. Every year at Passover, the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate leaves his comfortable coastal residence in Caesarea and marches into Jerusalem with a full cohort of soldiers. He does not come to worship, he comes to make sure the city does not burn. The soldiers set up in the Antonia fortress, which looms over the temple complex, and they watch the crowds through the porticos, and they wait for someone to try something, because Passover is the celebration of the last time God delivered his people from a foreign empire. It is the story of liberation, and there are almost 300,000 people packed into a city, humming with revolutionary energy, celebrating a story about the death of Pharaoh, while the Roman standards fly over their most sacred building. Into this pressure cooker, on Sunday, rides a man from Galilee on a young donkey. He rides directly toward the temple. The crowd, made up largely of pilgrims who have heard the rumors about him, breaks into a chant lifted straight from Psalm 118. They shout, "Hosanna," which literally means "save now." They cover the road with cloaks and branches. This is coronation language, what you do when a king comes home. Pilate is watching from his fortress. The temple aristocracy is watching from the porticos. Everyone with any political sense in the city knows that this looks like the start of something. Jesus rides straight to the temple. He walks in. He looks around at everything, at the courts, at the money changers, at the animal sellers, at the sacrifices, at the smoke, at the noise. And then, according to Mark, because it was already late in the day, he simply leaves. He walks out of the city and back to Bethany, about 2 miles east, to spend the night at the house of some friends. Nothing happens on Sunday. The confrontation is coming on Monday. Monday morning, they walk back into Jerusalem. Somewhere on the road, near the little village of Bethphage, they pass the fig tree. He curses it. His disciples take note but do not understand it. They keep walking. He enters the temple. And this time, he does not just look around. This is where you have to picture the temple as it actually was, not as it is in most people's imagination. Herod the Great had been rebuilding it for almost 50 years by the time Jesus walked into it. It was one of the largest religious complexes anywhere in the Roman world. The outer courtyard alone covered 35 acres. The walls of massive white limestone soared over 150 feet high. Some of the foundation stones were blocks of stone the size of a modern shipping container, quarried, dragged, and placed by hand. A few of those stones are still visible today at the base of what tourists call the Western Wall. The main sanctuary was covered in gold plating so bright that, according to the historian Josephus, you could not look at it in direct sunlight without going blind. Now add the sound and the smell to that visual, the bleating of thousands of sheep and goats waiting to be sacrificed, the lowing of oxen, the cooing of doves in their cages, the metallic clink of coins being exchanged, the chanting of the Levites from the courts above the outer walls, the smoke from the great altar rising day and night, carrying the scent of burning fat and roasting meat into the air over the entire city. Blood running in channels along the floor of the priest's court, draining into the Kidron Valley below. It looked from the outside like the most alive thing in the ancient world. Inside the outer courtyard, called the Court of the Gentiles, the only part of the temple where non-Jewish God-fearers were allowed to come and pray, there was a market. Tables set up by money changers exchanging foreign coinage for the specific Tyrian shekels required to pay the temple tax. Pens of sheep and doves and oxen sold for sacrifice at prices that had been inflated to a level modern scholars describe as extortionate, and a functional monopoly running beneath the whole operation. If a pilgrim brought his own animal from home, the priests could inspect it and declare it blemished, and then the pilgrim had to buy an approved animal from the temple market anyway. Everyone knew the game. Some people called it the Bazaar of Annas, after the high priestly family that ran the concession. The scholarly consensus is that by the time of Jesus, the temple aristocracy had turned this system into something close to a mafia operation. The Ananias family, which held the high priesthood on and off for decades, was among the wealthiest families in the entire province. There is a passage in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Tractate Pesachim, where later rabbis look back at this era and lament the corruption of the priesthood. They say, in effect, "Woe to us for the house of Annas, woe for their whispers." The temple was busy, rich, and famous. On any measurable metric, it was thriving, and according to every prophet who had spoken in Israel for the previous 7 centuries, it was dead. That is the tension Jesus walks into on Monday morning. To understand what happens next, you have to understand something about how Mark wrote his gospel. Mark is the shortest of the 4 gospels. It is also almost certainly the earliest. Most scholars date it to sometime in the 60s AD, about 35 years after the events it describes. It moves fast. Its Greek is unpolished, closer to spoken street language than to literary prose. On a first reading, it feels breathless and simple, like someone recounting what happened without editing. That first impression is wrong. Mark is the most literarily sophisticated of the 4 Gospels in a very specific way. He uses a technique that scholars now call intercalation, which is a fancy word for a very old storytelling move. The technique is this: you start a story. Before you finish it, you interrupt it with a second story. Then you finish the first story. The 2 stories, wrapped around each other, are meant to be read as commentary on each other. The inside story explains the outside story. The outside story frames the inside story. Bakers know this technique instinctively. 2 slices of bread filling in the middle. Scholars call it a Markan sandwich. Once you learn to see it, you find it everywhere in Mark. There is the story of a woman with a hemorrhage who touches Jesus' cloak in a crowd and is healed. That story is wrapped inside another story about Jesus being called to raise a little girl from the dead. 2 acts of healing, 2 women, and stories that only make sense when you read them together. Faith, uncleanness, and life pulled out of death. There is the story of Jesus being accused by his own family of being out of his mind. That story is wrapped around another story about Jesus being accused by the religious authorities of being possessed by a demon. 2 accusations, 1 buried truth about who the accusers really are. Mark does this at least 7 distinct times in a gospel of only 16 chapters. It is not an accident. It is his signature move. When you see the pattern, you know that you are meant to read the outer story and the inner story as one story, which brings us back to Monday morning. Because if you actually read the section of Mark's Gospel that contains the fig tree, and you read it slowly, you will notice something. It is a sandwich. Mark chapter 11 verse 12 begins with Jesus leaving Bethany, hungry, seeing the fig tree, finding no fruit on it, and cursing it. That is the first slice. Then Mark drops the fig tree completely. He does not mention it again for the next 12 verses. Instead, he tells you what happens next. Jesus walks into the temple, sees the marketplace inside the court of the Gentiles, and drives out the money changers and the animal sellers. He turns over the tables. He blocks people from carrying merchandise through the courts. And then he quotes 2 of the Hebrew prophets in the same sentence, mashing together a line from Isaiah and a line from Jeremiah. He says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Then that evening, he leaves Jerusalem and goes back to Bethany again. That is the filling. Then, in verse 20, first thing in the morning they walk back toward Jerusalem. They pass the same fig tree, and Peter notices that the tree Jesus cursed the day before is not just dying. It is dead. Dead from the roots up. That is the second slice. Bread, filling, bread, wrapped on purpose. Now ask yourself the question Mark wants you to ask. If the fig tree is the outer story and the temple is the inner story, what is Mark trying to say to you? The 2 stories are the same story. The tree Jesus cursed and the temple he cleansed are the same tree. He is not cursing the tree because he is hungry and cranky. The reason is that he is about to do to the temple symbolically what the withering of the tree will show visibly. This story is Mark's way of telling you in advance what the cleansing of the temple actually means. It is not a purification of the priesthood or a reform of the sacrifice system. It is a verdict on the whole institution. And the withering of the tree, the next morning, is the seal on the verdict. If you did not know Mark's technique, you would miss this completely. You would read the tree as one weird incident and the tables as another weird incident and never notice that they are two panels of the same painting, which is exactly what Bertrand Russell missed, and exactly what everyone who has ever accused Jesus of pettiness over a plant has missed. But we are still only at the surface, because Mark's sandwich only tells you that these two events belong together. It does not yet tell you why the fig tree, specifically, was the metaphor Jesus chose. To understand that, you have to go back a lot further than the 1st century. You have to go back to the prophets. The Hebrew Bible does not talk about fig trees the way a farmer would. It talks about fig trees the way a poet would. A fig tree, in Israel's sacred literature, is almost never just a fig tree. It is a symbol. And the symbol is remarkably consistent for the better part of 1,000 years. The pattern begins in the Torah itself. When Adam and Eve realize they are naked, in Genesis chapter 3, they cover themselves with fig leaves. That is the first mention of the tree in the Bible. Fig leaves become the primal covering, the thing you hide behind when you have been exposed. But the sustained symbolism starts later, in the prophetic books. Consider the prophet Hosea, who was preaching in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century before Christ. In Hosea chapter 9 verse 10, God says something extraordinary about how he first found the people of Israel. He says, "Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first ripe fig on the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers." Israel is a fig. When the God of Sinai first met Israel in the wilderness, they were like the very first ripe fig on the tree, the most treasured fruit of the season. Every farmer in the region would have understood the emotional weight of that image. The first ripe fig is the one you save for the person you love most. Then Hosea flips the image. In the same chapter, verse 16, he says of Israel in his own day, "Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit." Israel was the beloved fig. Israel became the barren tree. That is Hosea's message, delivered decades before the Assyrian Empire came and destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC. 100 years later, the prophet Jeremiah picks up the same symbol and hammers it. Jeremiah is preaching in the southern kingdom of Judah, in Jerusalem itself, in the years before the Babylonian invasion. In Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13, the voice of the Lord speaks through the prophet. "I will surely gather them," declares the Lord. "There will be no grapes on the vine, no figs on the fig tree, and even the leaves will wither." Read that line again slowly. No figs on the fig tree. Even the leaves will wither. 6 centuries before Jesus walks up to a specific fig tree with leaves on the road outside Jerusalem and speaks a curse against it, and comes back the next morning to find the leaves themselves withered, Jeremiah has already written the script. The image of a leafless, fruitless fig tree is the specific image the God of Israel uses, through Jeremiah, to describe what judgment on the covenant people is going to look like. Then Micah, roughly the same century as Hosea, takes the metaphor into the first person. Micah chapter 7 verse 1 begins with the prophet almost sobbing, "Woe is me, for I have become like one who, after the summer fruit has been gathered, finds no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig for which my soul longs." The prophet, standing in for the God of the covenant, is walking through the vineyard, walking through the orchard, looking for fruit, finding none, and grieving. This is not coincidence. It is not that the prophets and the gospel writer just happen to use fig trees. There is a specific tradition running through the Hebrew scriptures like a musical theme, in which Israel is a fig tree, and the presence or absence of fruit is the measurement of whether the covenant is being kept. There is more. In the book of Judges, the trees of the forest go looking for a king to reign over them, and the fig tree is one of the trees they ask. The image of a fig tree as leader, as representative, is embedded in Israel's oldest folklore. In the book of 1 Kings, when Solomon's kingdom is at its peak of shalom and blessing, the writer describes it this way: "Every man in Israel sat under his own vine and his own fig tree." The fig tree is the symbol of covenantal flourishing. Fruit under leaves means the covenant is being kept. No fruit under leaves means the covenant is not. And there is a parallel image running alongside the fig tree image that is even more famous. Isaiah chapter 5 contains what scholars call the Song of the Vineyard. The prophet describes his beloved planting a vineyard on a fertile hill, clearing away the stones, planting the choicest vines, building a watchtower, hewing out a winepress. He does everything a farmer could possibly do to guarantee a good harvest. And then Isaiah delivers the verdict. He looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. Then the prophet turns and speaks in the voice of the God who planted the vineyard. "What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down." The vineyard, Isaiah then explicitly says, is the house of Israel, and what God looked for in that vineyard was justice, and what he found was bloodshed. What he looked for was righteousness, and what he found was an outcry. Jesus knew this passage. He quotes from it, structures parables around it, and in the same last week of his life, in Matthew chapter 21, tells a story called the parable of the wicked tenants, that is a deliberate retelling of Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard, with himself, the son of the vineyard owner, cast in the story. The Song of the Vineyard is not obscure to him. It is a text he has been living inside. There is also this. Somewhere earlier in his public ministry, according to Luke chapter 13, Jesus told a parable that will land differently once you know the fig tree episode is coming. A man plants a fig tree in his vineyard. He comes looking for fruit on it for 3 years and finds none. He tells his gardener, "Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" The gardener asks for 1 more year. "Let me dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down." 3 years of looking for fruit and finding none, then 1 final year, then the cutting. Jesus' public ministry lasted by traditional reckoning 3 years. Then came 1 final week. Then came a tree by the road, in leaf, with no fruit under the leaves. He is not inventing a metaphor on Monday morning outside Bethphage. He is picking up a 1500-year-old symbol and a parable he himself has already told, and using it exactly the way every literate Jewish reader of Mark's Gospel would have expected the symbol to be used. His disciples missed it. They were tired and hungry and did not have the framework. But Peter, who is Mark's likely source for the earliest recollection of this event, eventually saw it. And Mark, writing the Gospel down decades later, structured his account so that no attentive reader could miss it. The tree is Israel. Specifically, the tree is Israel's covenant faithfulness, expressed through the institution meant to embody that faithfulness in the middle of Jerusalem, which was the temple. But the choice of a fig tree specifically, and not some other tree, and not a vine, and not an olive, has one more layer to it. And this last layer is not literary at all, it is botanical, and it is the layer that turns Jesus' action from a strong symbol into something closer to legal evidence in a courtroom. Because Palestinian fig trees do something that most people who have never lived in the Mediterranean have no idea about. Fig trees in the region of Judea grow differently from most fruit trees. The way an apple tree works, or a peach tree, or a cherry tree, is roughly what most people picture. The tree comes out of dormancy in spring. It buds, it leaves out. The leaves grow to full size. Then, after the leaves are fully developed, the tree flowers. Then the flowers turn into fruit. Leaves first, fruit later. Fig trees in the Eastern Mediterranean do the opposite. There is a specific stage in the fig tree's growth cycle, called in Hebrew pagim, which comes before the leaves fully open. Pagim are small, hard, unripe pre-figs. They are green, roughly the size of a marble, and they are not really pleasant on their own, but they are technically edible. Hungry travelers in the ancient world knew to eat them. They are also the botanical guarantee that the tree will produce a normal crop of ripe figs later in the summer. Here is the crucial fact. The pagim appear before the full flush of leaves. On a healthy Palestinian fig tree, the small pre-figs come out first, often on the bare branches, and only after they appear do the leaves fully unfurl. A tree in the early spring, if it is going to produce a crop that year, will show its pagim while the leaves are still just opening, which means, in reverse, that a fig tree in full leaf without pagim is a tree that is not going to produce fruit at all that year. The leaves are a promise. The pagim are the guarantee that the promise will be kept. A tree with leaves and no pagim is a tree that is broken. Its leaf display is not tracking with what should be happening in its branches. In agricultural terms, it is a tree that is going to be pulled up and replaced. It is, in the most literal sense, a tree that lies. Now go back and read Mark chapter 11, verse 13 very carefully. Mark says two things in a single sentence that most translations flatten. He says first that Jesus saw the tree from a distance in leaf, and he says second that Jesus went to it to see if perhaps he might find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. And then Mark adds the line that Bertrand Russell seized on, for it was not the season of figs. Almost every reader hears that last line as a straightforward apology for why the tree had no fruit. Not the season, cannot blame the tree. But that reading collapses when you know the botany, because in the actual growing cycle of a Judean fig tree, in the actual month of Nisan, which is early April, which is Passover, that tree should have had pagim on it, not ripe figs. Nobody was expecting ripe figs. Everyone knew the ripe fig harvest was still 2 months out. But the small hard pre-figs, the early evidence that the tree was going to produce, those should have been there. Mark is not saying it was not fig season, so of course there were no figs. He is saying something much stranger and more precise. He is saying it was not the season of figs. And in the growth cycle of a fig tree in leaf that early in the spring, that phrase is not exculpation, it is indictment. The tree was in leaf. In the early spring, in leaf before ripe fig season, a fig tree that is in leaf should also be showing its pre-figs. This tree was not. It was performing spring while producing nothing. It was announcing life while carrying no evidence of life. The leaves were a lie. Jesus does not curse a tree that failed to have ripe figs in April. He curses a tree that put on a display of foliage that its branches could not back up. Now hold that image in your mind and walk with him into the temple. Because from the outside, the temple in Jerusalem in the spring of 30 AD was the greatest show of covenant life anywhere on earth. Gold plating on the walls, sacrifices burning every hour of daylight, thousands of pilgrims pressing in from every direction, the chanting of the psalms, the smoke of the incense rising from the holy place, the high priest in his robes. Everything about the temple in that moment looked exactly like a tree in full leaf. But when Jesus walked up to it and looked for the fruit the covenant was supposed to produce, which was justice, prayer for the nations, honest worship, honest priesthood, care for the poor, he found no pagim. Where there should have been a house of prayer, there was a marketplace. Where there should have been shelter for the poor, there was extortion. The sons of Anas were running a concession stand in the one place on earth where the Creator had commanded a house of worship for all the nations. Leaves everywhere, no fruit anywhere. A tree in full spring display, with nothing beneath the leaves. He curses the tree in the morning, turns over the tables in the afternoon, and goes back to Bethany for the night. And in the morning, when they walk back past the tree, it is dead, not just fruitless, not just cursed, withered from the roots up. Mark's sandwich has clicked into place. The tree is the temple, the withering is the verdict. And within 40 years, the Roman legions of Titus will confirm the verdict when they burn the temple to the ground. To understand what Jesus did on Monday morning, you have to stop thinking of it as a miracle and start thinking of it as a court case. Ancient prophets did this. It has a technical name. Scholars call it a prophetic sign act. When a message was so heavy that words alone would not carry it, the prophet did not just speak the message, the prophet performed it. The voice from Sinai commanded Isaiah to walk around Jerusalem naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign against Egypt and Cush. That same voice commanded Jeremiah to buy a clay jar and smash it on the ground at the potsherd gate as a sign that the covenant God was about to smash the nation. Ezekiel was commanded to lie on his left side for 390 days to represent the years of Israel's guilt, and then lie on his right side for another 40 days to represent the guilt of Judah. Ezekiel was commanded to shave off his own hair and beard, weigh them on a scale, and burn 1/3 of them in the middle of the city. These are not stage tricks. These are legal enactments. In the ancient Near East, a prophet performing an action was considered to be sealing the message. The action bound the words. Once the sign act was performed, the verdict was no longer up for debate. It was going to happen. That is what Jesus does on Monday morning. The cursing of the fig tree is not an outburst. It is a sign act. Every element of it is deliberate. The tree in leaf without pagim, the specific curse spoken aloud in front of witnesses, the immediate walk into the temple, the overturning of the tables, the return to inspect the tree the next morning. Every part of it maps onto the language of a prophetic legal action. He is standing in the tradition of Jeremiah at the potsherd gate, doing what Ezekiel did with the hair, enacting the verdict that Hosea and Micah spoke 7 centuries earlier, and that has been coming due at compound interest ever since. And the message of the sign act is a message that Israel's own prophets, in Israel's own scriptures, spoke over and over. When the covenant people put on the display of covenant life while producing no covenant fruit, the God of Israel will not accept the display forever. Leaves cannot substitute for figs. The temple cannot substitute for what the temple was built to do. Which means Bertrand Russell was reading exactly the right story with exactly the wrong lens. Russell read a moral tale about a man and a tree. He asked, "Is it fair to punish a tree for having no fruit out of season?" The answer, in his frame, is obviously no, and so the story becomes a scandal. But Russell was reading a gospel written by a man who signed his signature into the text with 2 slices of bread and a filling in the middle. Mark did not think he was writing a moral tale about a man and a tree. Mark thought he was writing an account of a prophetic sign act performed by a man who understood himself to be the fulfillment of every warning the Hebrew prophets had ever given about the barrenness of the covenant people, delivered on the last week of that man's life, at the doorstep of the institution that had traded fruit for leaves. Ask the story what it was written to be, and the story answers you cleanly. Ask the story to be what it is not, and you will find, of course, that it fails your test. Russell's mistake is understandable. It is the mistake almost every reader who does not know Mark's structure and does not know the prophets and does not know the botany has made for 2,000 years. The mistake is treating a legal enactment as if it were a temper tantrum. Once you see what the sign act actually was, the moral objection collapses. But what rises in its place is heavier, not lighter. Because now the story is not embarrassing. Now it is terrifying. It is terrifying because it worked. The tree died, and 40 years later, in the summer of 70 AD, after a Jewish revolt against Roman occupation that had begun 4 years earlier and that Rome had come to end, the Emperor Vespasian's son Titus commanded a siege of Jerusalem. When the siege ended, the historian Josephus, an eyewitness, recorded what happened next. The Roman soldiers set fire to the temple. The gold plating melted and ran between the stones. The soldiers pried up the stones to get at the gold. When they finished, not one stone was left standing on another, exactly the way Jesus, later in the same week of that same Monday morning, had told his disciples it would happen. The withering of the tree in the morning was the sentence. The overturning of the tables in the afternoon was the reading of the charge. The burning of the temple 4 decades later was the execution of the verdict. None of this is comfortable. It is not supposed to be. But once you see it, you cannot go back to the version of the story where a hungry man loses his temper with a plant. That version was never really there. The only reason it looked like it was there is because we were not paying attention to the way Mark wrote his gospel, or to the prophets he was quoting, or to the botany of the specific tree, at the specific time of year, in the specific week we walked into at the beginning of this story. Mark told the truth on the surface. It was not the season of figs, but he told a deeper truth underneath the sentence. It was the season of judgment. Pull the lens back, and this story stops being about a tree at all. It becomes about a pattern that runs through the whole Bible. The pattern goes like this. Something is planted. Fruit is expected. When the harvest arrives, only leaves are there. The pattern begins in Eden. The Creator plants a garden. He puts humans in it. He gives them one prohibition and many blessings. And when he comes walking in the cool of the day, he finds his image-bearers hiding behind fig leaves. That is the first time in the Bible that fig leaves appear, and they appear as a cover for the absence of what should have been there: trust, transparency, and the fruit the garden was planted to grow. It repeats with Israel in the wilderness. The Lord delivers them from Egypt. He gives them the law. He plants them in the land like a vine. And in Isaiah chapter 5, the voice of the Lord stands over the vineyard he has cultivated and asks, "What more could I have done for my vineyard than what I have done for it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes?" And it repeats with the exile. The prophets warn for centuries that the covenant has become foliage without fruit. The temple has become a hiding place for extortion. The priests have become traders. Eventually, in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's army breaks Jerusalem and burns the first temple. The pattern is unmistakable. Every generation the covenant people put out leaves. The Lord comes looking for fruit. When he finds none, judgment eventually falls. After the judgment, a remnant returns, and something is planted again. This is why Jesus' action outside Bethphage lands so heavily when you understand what it is doing. He is not introducing a new theme, and he is not making up a metaphor. What he is doing is picking up the oldest theme in the Hebrew Scriptures and enacting it personally as one who has come to the end of the pattern. But the story does not end at the end of the pattern, because on Thursday of that same week, in an upper room in Jerusalem, Jesus takes bread and wine and gives them to his disciples and says something extraordinary. He says, in effect, that his own body and blood are about to become the new center of the covenant. On Friday, he is arrested, tried, and executed on a Roman cross outside the city. On Sunday, according to every gospel writer, the tomb is empty. And by the time Mark writes his gospel, in the 60s AD, the message the earliest Christians are proclaiming across the Roman Empire is that the temple is no longer the point. Jesus himself has become the meeting place between God and humanity. His body is the true temple. The fruit that the fig tree failed to produce, the fruit that the Herodian temple failed to produce, the fruit that the covenant people had failed for generations to produce, is now, in this one person, being produced in full. The Apostle Paul later writes, in his letter to the Galatians, about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. That is a fig tree bearing pagim. It is what the covenant was always meant to look like. Look also at the way John's Gospel, written a generation after Mark, remembers Jesus during that same last week in Jerusalem. In John chapter 2, at an earlier moment of temple confrontation, Jesus says something that his listeners take as a threat and that his disciples only understand later. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The bystanders assume he is talking about the building. Herod's temple, they point out, has been under construction for 46 years. John then adds a note in his own voice. Jesus, John writes, was speaking about the temple of his body. The stone building comes down in 70 AD. The body of Jesus, according to the earliest witnesses, comes back up on the first Sunday after his execution. One structure ends. Another takes its place. The fruit-bearing center of the covenant moves from a piece of architecture in Jerusalem to a person walking out of a tomb outside the city. The pattern in the Old Testament ends in judgment. In the New Testament, according to the earliest witnesses, it ends in a resurrection that reopens the possibility of fruit, which is why the fig tree story, once you see what it is not just a warning. It is the hinge on which a much bigger story turns. The old system produced leaves without figs, and it was ended. The new center, according to the gospel writers, is a person, and the fruit will come through him. And the criticism Bertrand Russell offered in 1927, that Jesus was petty and unjust with a tree, was aimed at the wrong story entirely. Russell thought he was reading an ethical parable. He was actually reading the sealing of a verdict that 15 prophets had already delivered, and that history itself would confirm 40 years later. The wrong lens sees a moral scandal. The right lens sees a courtroom. And the courtroom, once it has closed, opens onto something else, not another temple, not another priesthood. A person standing outside a tomb on the first day of a new week. Which brings the story, finally, to the question it was always going to ask. The story of Jesus and the fig tree does not stay in Jerusalem in the year 30 AD. It walks off the page and asks the reader something. The reader is the point. Not because Jesus meant the story as a moral allegory. He did not. He meant it as a specific prophetic action against a specific institution in a specific week. But once the story is written down, and once the gospel is being read, it turns into the same question every prophet in the Hebrew tradition asked their listeners. Where are the leaves without fruit? The question is uncomfortable because it does not stay in the past tense. It is not just about the temple. It aims at anything that puts on the display of life while producing no evidence of life. The most obvious application, and the one Jesus was making, is to religious systems. When a church or a denomination or a movement puts on the outward signs of the Spirit's presence while producing no righteousness, no justice, no honest care for the poor, no honest worship, the story of the fig tree stands over that system like a warning that has been standing there for 2,000 years. But it does not stop with religious systems. The mirror the story becomes is broader than that. It can be the career that looks impressive from the outside while producing no actual value inside. It can be a relationship that seems warm to friends and starves in private. Some readers hearing this will already be thinking of a public reputation that has outrun the private reality by years, sometimes by decades. Others will be thinking of a moral persona that announces itself constantly while carrying no small hard prefigs of what it claims to be. Wherever the leaves are ahead of the branches, the story of the tree by the road is asking its question. The story does not accuse anyone in particular. It simply asks the question the prophets asked, in the specific image the prophets used. And it lets the person reading it hear the question wherever the question happens to land. The Bible works this way. It contains layers of meaning that only open when the reader is ready to see them. It lets earlier readers miss the layers without penalty. It lets later readers find the layers without commentary. And it lets the same passage that seemed like an embarrassment in one century become, in another century, the thing that was quietly working on the person all along. The tree by the road outside Bethphage was cursed for one specific reason. It advertised life it did not have. Leaves without pagim. The rest of the story of the Gospels, the arrest and the cross and the empty tomb, is about the possibility, offered by the same figure who cursed the tree, of a different kind of tree. A tree whose small, hard prefigs show early. A tree whose leaves do not have to lie about what is underneath them. That possibility is what the story is finally pointing at. Not the death of the tree, the alternative to it. The mirror stays open, the alternative is offered. Go back to the beginning of this video. A man walks up to a tree on a spring morning. Its leaves are full, its branches empty. He speaks a sentence over it, enters a temple full of activity and smoke and gold and money changers, turns over the tables and walks out. By the next morning, the tree is dead from the roots. Nothing about the scene has changed, but everything about what the scene means has changed. Because you have walked into Passover week with the crowds and stood in the court of the Gentiles among the money changers. Mark, sitting somewhere in Rome 3 decades later, wrapped the tree around the temple on purpose, and the wrapping is visible now. Hosea and Jeremiah and Micah, 7 centuries earlier, delivered the exact image Jesus would enact outside Bethphage. And a fig tree in leaf without pagim, to a Judean farmer, is a tree that announces life it does not have. So the story Bertrand Russell called a moral defect turns out to have been a prophetic verdict, sealed 40 years before the Roman legions of Titus arrived to execute it. The mirror the story holds up is still open. Somewhere, in the branches of every life being lived, there is either pagim or there is not. The story asks only that one question, in the specific image the prophets used, and it lets each person hear it wherever it happens to land. If this changed how you see the Gospels, the video on screen right now goes into the 18 missing years between when Jesus is 12 and when he begins his public ministry at 30. It is the story of what Scripture does not tell us, and what a single Greek word buried in the tradition suggests about the life he was actually living during those years. Click it, subscribe on the way, and it will be there next.